And we're back, Pat. Season 2, Episode 7, Talkin' Thrones overall, Episode 17, entitled A Man Without Honor. Pat, I've known quite a few of these guys in my life. What about you?
Hey, Dom, I think the Talkin' TV family understands that this is a world without honor, not necessarily just men, but it could be just men.
That wasn't even that funny,
know.
Relatively. I'm just so preordained and like so used to laughing inherently.
Yeah, I don't know. Nobody's got honor in the game.
Nobody's got honor in Westeros, in this world, just in general. Nobody has honor
except for Ned. But
except for Ned, and well, they call him Dead Ned for a reason. All of that and more on tonight's episode of Talkin' Thrones. God damn, Chris kicked so much ass with that intro. Like, I don't know about you, but like, I don't know. It might just be because it's almost September already, but like, I'm already still feeling the chills just that intro alone. I'm like, oh, maybe we weren't being so facetious with the whole winter is coming thing, but we started this.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very somber opening that we have for this show. It's a little bit lengthy too, but like, hopefully our audience is okay with it.
It's kind of like the Game of. It's not nearly as lengthy as the Game of Thrones intro theme itself. Because like Pat, I don't know about you, but like that intro theme, like, were you a guy like, did you listen to it? Did you go sit through it the whole time every time you watch a new episode, or were you a fast forwarder? You're like, okay, I just want to get to the show. I've only got an hour.
I'll be honest, like when I originally watched the show, it was a bunch of dinner parties and we sat down and we ate up the opening every single time. When it showed us the different locations, we were like popping like, yeah, King's Landing, it's going to happen this episode. So there was a lot of excitement that the beginning brought to us when we were watching it. Now that I'm like binge watching it after the fact, I'm just like skip. Let's get to the point. The meat and potatoes. I
absolutely get that. Yeah, my whole thing is every time I want to skip it, I'm like, oh, it's my favorite intro. It's my favorite theme song of all time, and I'm just like every time I'm like, I can't resist. It's so good every time. The graphics are so good. Like whoever crafted that graphic sequence, like props to Ramin Djawadi as well for the score.
Yeah, I want to say that the graphics and the work that went into the opening is amazing, and I do find myself, catching myself like just watching it, and then like turning off HBO and going on, moving on to things. Right. So like it's not like I'm just like skipping it because it's bad. It's just. I want to do the research for this show and move,
right.
Get to
you're like, I got work to do. Yeah, get to it. Yeah. It's like, I'm doing this for a reason now. I'm doing this for a recap show. It's like, I got a podcast to do. But anyway, speaking of said episode, shall we?
Yeah, let's talk about it. What was your favorite part, right?
Oh, or man, what was my favorite part?
The first part that you want to talk about.
There were a lot of good parts in this episode. This is a really, really good episode. I'm not going to lie. After like 2 episodes that felt very much like midpoint episodes, I'll say, the last one had a lot of interesting parts. This episode is entitled A Man Without Honor. The second episode directed by David Petrarca. And the first after a couple written by Benioff and Weiss.
Dom, is that
directed by David Nutter. I just realized I screwed up the director. Oh, man. That was my first director, Freudian slip.
That's okay. It happens. But, like, am I going to guess that the Man Without Honor is Theon Greyjoy?
Well, there are a couple of men without honor in this episode. They're like, I believe this episode really should be called The Men Without Honor because, of course, our opening scene in Winterfell, unfortunately, after, again, Theon's so brilliant decision to conquer Winterfell last episode from every single sense of the level, and he's already suffering for it because he wakes up. He, of course, realizes immediately that Osha tricked him. I believe, what's it called? He beats on his main guy for letting him go.
Well, he's kind of like peacocking, right?
A little bit.
He's just like, how could you let the half-wit and how could you let the cripple and all that stuff get away with it? And then his man is like, well, the wildling that you were sleeping with clearly is the one with the intelligence. And got away with this, and he just starts beating this guy,
it's like, honestly,
ruthlessly.
Like, if I'm being honest, this probably should have happened a couple of episodes ago. It's just like, but it just goes against everything that Theon's character is. Like, we know that he's putting this on as an act, but he's also doing it because he's like pissed because this guy like just doesn't respect him. But like, I'm honestly kind of amazed because I'm just thinking in my head when that scene happens. I'm like, where was this when they were originally taking off on the docks? Like, come on, man, if you had this in you the whole time.
Here's my question is, like, who is the right-hand man that's sort of giving him advice about the Iron Mark?
Yeah, Dagmir, Cleft Jaw.
Yeah, so the main thing is, I think, in the notes that you wrote, we were kind of like messaging each other back and forth. You wrote that like he smiles and like he sort of respects
Yeah,
Theon
it was
for
a little
getting a backbone.
yeah,
But like, do you think, here's my take, is that the reason why he's smiling is like, oh man, Theon is such a
such an idiot.
waste. And
Yeah.
yeah, like he just doesn't get the Ironborn. So
It's
the
kind of
fact,
it's got to be it because again, like I said, they changed. This is such a drastic change from how they went in the books because in the books, the whole thing is that Theon's men, even though they're skeptical of him, they're kind of with him until the end. The way Theon's downfall comes from Ramsay originally because the whole thing is that Ramsay disguises himself as the original Reek and then comes back and acts this ploy, when Sir Roderick is amassing a force to take back Winterfell, and then his force kills Sir Roderick, and then he beats Theon and massacres the Ironborn and burns Winterfell down. Here it's like, no, his Ironborn sell him out because they're fucking just sick of him. They know they're not going to win this fight. It's almost like Dagmere just engineered this thing in order to like take control, but then they all end up getting killed by the Boltons anyway. So I don't know, like.
yeah, it's very muddy in terms of how it plays out. But like,
Right.
if you're thinking about the seeds that are being planted, it's like he's watching Theon implode in front of him,
Right.
and looking through the lens of the future episodes, we understand that things don't go well for Theon. So
Right.
it's one of those things where is he looking to seize control of the Ironborn, and that's why Theon ultimately gets left in the hands of Bolton in the TV series. And it sounds interesting, like the
Right.
books take it in a different direction. I
Yeah,
think that
it goes in a vastly different direction, especially considering the fact that both the books and the show are very ambiguous about, I shouldn't say that, sorry, not the books. The show is very ambiguous about the transition of how Theon got from Winterfell to the Dreadfort, where he is for all of season 3 and 4. And they kind of sort of tell you it at the end of season 3, but like it's not very well explained, kind of, because the last shot we see of Theon is him getting dragged off by the Ironborn, as in like they're just taking him home,
Yeah. It's I think for this episode, bringing it back to that, it's this is the start, right? It just sort
Yeah.
of shows that Bran and Osha got away with Odor and Rickon, and
Yes. Oh, man. And of
basically,
course, a very clever setup, I will say, when they stumble, again, continuing, like you said last episode, with the planting of the seeds, where you have them stumble upon the same farm where they sent the farm boys originally, the 2 Winterfell orphans. And, Rickon asks if they have some food. But then we never see what happens. The next thing you know, I think it's very cleverly put together how the episode, resolves this storyline where you have the Ironborn finding the farm, right? Maester Lewin's with them and everything. Theon, of course, exchanges some words with him along the way where he's like, oh, I won't hurt them much. And Maester Lewin's kind of reminding him, he's like, they're boys and you live with them. Like he's kind of on the opinion, like, you better not touch them. And he's like, they disobeyed me. And kind of the beginning of just more reinforcements of the idea that Theon has no idea what he's doing, like, at all. But they handle the resolve very, very clever, in a very clever way, I think, from a story perspective, where you have them arrive at the farm, they find, what's it called? The farmer is either playing dumb, or you don't know if he's actually hiding them or not. And then him and Dagmere basically have this moment where they realize, okay, we're in a bit of a pickle because they're clearly not here. And we can't go back to Winterfell empty-handed, otherwise we'll look like fools. So they end up later on, Theon back in Winterfell. This is actually how the episode wraps up. Is Maester Lewin is dragged into the court and discovers that Theon has 2 burned, charred corpses that he hangs in front of the entire crowd, and it's meant to assume to be Bran and Rickon. But obviously, this kind of is a little bit of a spoilers for next episode, but. Obviously, like we said, this was not going to be spoiler free. It's the impetus that Theon instead had the 2 Winterfell farm boys burned and butchered and hung up there because they could find them.
Like, I agree. Like, for this episode, leaving it on that kind of a cliffhanger where you, as the audience member, are supposed to think that Bran and Rickon got caught and they were burned. I think it does work. Obviously, like, I've been through the show, like, this is my 3rd go, kind of. So, for the most part, it's like, I understand that it's the farm boys.
Right.
Like, the whole trick of it all is lost on me. But
right.
I think they do sort of, for the first time watcher, basically set it up perfectly. It's you could pick up on it. They have the seeds where it's like Bran says, hey, feed these orphans and keep them at your farm, and that will be sort of the payment for the labor that we're giving you to, survive the winter. And basically, if you remember Bran sort of sending those orphans there, you can sort of piece together, if you're really, playing Sherlock Holmes with it, you can say, hey, what about those orphans? Is that possibly who Theon just burned? So it is sort of transparent. But at the same time, the seeds are planted well, that it waits till the next episode before the big reveal happens. But it's never meant to be this like hoodwink. I think it's pretty clear what's taking place.
Right, definitely.
You just have to be paying attention.
Right, exactly. And again, it's the brilliance. I think that this is attributed not just to the show in general, but to the HBO of it all, because HBO to me has always been very, very clever with their dramas, where if you are not paying attention, you will miss something, because there's all these clever little cues hidden and crafted throughout the editing and the camera work and the set design and everything else that goes into the filmmaking that just shows that, like, yeah, this is a really, really just impressively well made and put together story, and I love when they can do those kind of little cut around tricks, where they like bring back other sequences in that took place out of order. But what's it called? But wrapping it up with Winterfell, next we move to my there's a lot of scenes in this episode that are competing to be my favorite sequence,
Yeah, there's a lot of cool character moments. I think we were talking about it earlier before the show, and it's like the one that we're about to mention, I think, is when every single person that has ever watched this show falls in love with Ygritte.
Yes, absolutely. Ygritte is the MV friggin' P of this sector of the show. One of my favorite characters. Like, again, like I said, she had her introduction last episode, and oh man, talk about a sparking firecracker right there. I just have some of the quotes, just a few of the quotes. Like, I feel like every single line that Ygritte has in this entire episode is a banger. So
she's not putting up with any crap from Jon Snow, right, or literally any man in this universe. She can hold her own, in this universe. She just goes for it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, some of the lines are in the beginning when she's like, "Do you have sheep? Do you have sheep at the wall?" And he's like, "No." And she's like, "With your hands, then? No wonder you're all so miserable." That's the opening line. That's the opening line that she has. And then I found the quote that you were talking about when she's asking him. It's the third scene with them where she's like, "How long until we get back to your crows?" And then what's it called? And then when she starts teasing him about it, it's like, "Oh, what do you think they'll say when they hear about you and me?" And she's like, "Nothing happened between you and me." And then she goes to the whole thing where she says, "I swear at old Master King Crow, sir, we were only close together for warmth. And then I felt it right up against me backside like a club." I won't go into further details, but either way, it goes into now I can never marry a perfumed lord. Like, this is the representative of everything that the wildlings, like, represent as a people. And, like, there is no better example of that than here.
And her proof was, "I'll show you the bruise on my tailbone," and it's very like she's very specific and like stabbing the dagger right into him, and you can just like Kit Harington, like you could see on his face like how uncomfortable Jon Snow is.
It's great because he's just reacting to her in this scene. Like she is leading him, and Rose Leslie, God bless her. Oh man, she is going for it in every single minute, and it's absolutely brilliant. But like, what's awesome too is that even though this is very clear where this is going. She knows these lands better than him. She is clearly leading him into a trap. He has no idea where he is. It's pretty easy to guess where this storyline is going to end. But that's not what this is about. This is about the experience. This is about, like,
I don't know if it's I don't know if it's easy to guess where it ends, but we know where the next stop is.
The logical next step is.
Yeah, it may or may not have something to do with a natural hot spa in the Crypt Cave. But we know some of the other things.
We know some of the other things that are in store for these two, and ultimately the tragedy of how it ends.
But based on the chemistry of the two characters and specifically the actors and how they bring it to life, we know that maybe a sexy hot spring scene makes sense.
Man. Oh man, just maybe just a little bit. Yeah, it's one of the best relationships on the show. It's probably one of my favorite relationships I've ever seen, just in general on TV. And you wouldn't think that a show like Game of Thrones would give us like, oh, the couple that we're rooting for to see if they stay together by the end. But hey, what do you know? There is still some good romance to be found in Westeros.
I think there's only one thing that can ever keep a good couple apart, and that's death do us part.
Yeah, exactly. Death do us part.
Man, did I just spoil it? I guess we'll get there.
More like a bow and arrow to the heart. But yeah, no, unfortunately we know that like death is not death basically comes for everyone, as is basically the theme of this show. But of course it ends with her leading him into a wildling ambush. She of course takes him out easily. By the time he realizes that it is way too late, he's surrounded by wildlings. She's like, told me you should have took me when you had the chance. But there's one interesting thing that comes out of this discussion that I think is, again, a little bit of a setup for how Jon is going to bring the wildlings into the fray, which is the idea of when what's it called? She's talking about the differences between the Southerners and the wildlings, and how, you know, she's basically all kind of grouping them together as the Andals. And Jon throws it right back in her face, where he's like, yeah, my blood's the blood of the first men too, just like yours, you know? So it's like, but then she throws it right back at him, where she's like, then why are we fighting each other? And that's true, you know? I find it very interesting because the wildlings and the Northmen have always had this really kind of interesting back and forth where they're mortal enemies, right? The wildlings obviously raid their farms or wherever, but they're also kin in a weird way, because they are all descended from this original group of the first men that ended up getting divided by this gigantic ice, you know, fortress that was raised via sorcery. And, you know, again, part of, I think, you know, one of the probably good things that comes out of the show is kind of that reunification and that kind of newfound peace between the Northerners and the wildlings, you know, and it all starts here.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. It's definitely world building. It's definitely setting up what it means to sort of that these two people work together in the end. And ultimately, you know, this show is very good at the subtle seeds and planting them over time, because once you get to that hard home episode, it's like you really know.
Yeah, you really know what they're up against.
Why both sides need to come together,
yes,
and why it needs to happen now.
Yes. Oh man, you're already getting me excited for hard home, Pat.
Yeah, hey, listen, that's one of the only episodes that makes the series worth watching, right? Because, like the whole first 5 seasons.
That's a little bit harsh.
Come on, the first 5 seasons is just leading up to that scene, and then you know, one season to build up the Battle of the Bastards, and it just makes the whole show worth it.
Yeah, it does. It really does. But that's pretty much the entirety of it. Again, it's all leading to Jon's parts become very minimalistic over the next couple of episodes. But for these last 2 where we got to focus on him a decent amount, it was rather enjoyable.
Dom, let's talk about minimalistic for a second.
Oh yeah.
What about the Arya scene?
Oh yeah. Harrenhal, cut to interior. Exterior Harrenhal. Tywin is just it's like a repeat of Garden of Bones. Tywin is back to just having every single person just brutally tortured and slaughtered. And he's talking to Sir Gregor, played by the second of 3 actors that would end up playing Sir Gregor Clegane, this being Ian White, who would also portray several of the giants on the show, doing the motion capture for it. He's a pretty big guy. It's understandable why. And he's talking to him, and he's like, we think it might be an infiltrator from the Brotherhood Without Banner, because it's like, yeah, because you're dealing with a faceless man. You're never going to find a faceless man. They specialize in stealth. They can literally be anyone. You know, so obviously, but of course, because Arya's inexperience ended up leading to, you know, now Tywin being on absolute high alert, and in a weird way, potentially like endangering Gendry more than she already was. And after that scene, it's just like quick casual scene where he looks at her and he's like, and he's like, oh, do you like mutton? He's like, I don't like mutton. Sit down, eat. And basically, he forces her to eat while they end up having a conversation, and he basically like almost kind of sort of deduces her identity. I don't know. Like, what did you just take away from that whole thing at the end where he's like, careful, girl. I enjoy you, but careful, you know? I mean, first off, the wording there is just really creepy, but
I think it's one of those things that's really strange that Tywin has sort of figured out that her whole thing's a ruse, and that she is relatively highborn.
Right.
And
he just doesn't know how highborn she is or who she is specifically.
Yeah. So, like, you know, obviously we're trying to believe that he's distracted and he's worried about the war and the plans of Robb and getting Jaime back. And, you know, he's not necessarily
He's a little
100%
preoccupied
on his game
right now.
Exactly. So he can't like put 2 and 2 together that somehow Arya Stark has landed in his lap. But at the same time, he is already like questioning her upbringing and the fact that her father was a Mason that, you know, could read and knew all about Valyrian steel and knew everything about, like, you know, royal families. And, you know,
it's a lot. He's like, that's a lot. Even for a commoner, that's a lot to know, you know, because like commoners, there's a reason why commoners weren't known for their intelligence, because for hundreds of thousands of years, it was denied to them because you couldn't actually be able to learn to read unless you were like in the top, you know, 1%, literally 1% of society.
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know if it's literally 1% in the medieval ages, but yeah,
Middle Ages.
It's definitely narrow, and you know, a fewer people control the masses. But I would say Arya, essentially, she speaks too well. You know, like
Yes, as a
is the whole
reminder,
thing?
he's like, "My lord, if you're gonna pose as the commoner, you may as well do
Yeah.
it right. My lord is proper."
Yeah, so he's basically figured out the whole situation that
Right.
she's
And
in.
he's just cool with it. He's just cool with it. He's like, yeah, cool. Little highboard. Not a northerner. Not a spy at all. You know? I'm just cool with that. You know? Like, it's a very bad judgment on his part. And again, makes me, and it really sucks because this was a storyline that I always loved so much. But now realizing that this was basically completely manufactured for the show, like the whole thing was that Arya overheard all of Tywin's plans, but Tywin never had any, like, one-on-one face-to-face interactions with her, not like this to this extent, you know.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like you have a you know, an actor, one that's playing Tywin, one that's playing Arya, and you just put them in the same scene and you kind of let things flow. And I think that's what it's all about, because it really is a great scene, but does it really make sense to the overall world?
Exactly. Really. It's one of those scenes where, again, you 100% hit it on the money. It makes no sense logistically, but the writing in it and the dialogue and the conversation in and of itself is just so much fun. To me, I feel like this is part of like a working theory that I have just about Arya Stark in general, that I think that Benioff and Weiss worked out with Martin, like before they got into the show, which is that because I'll say this right now. We'll see if I'm correct by the end, you know, if Martin ever gets out these books. But because of all the characters that Martin had fleshed out, he had a pretty good idea of where they were going to end. Arya is the one he had no idea where her arc was going to go. So he basically, Benioff and Weiss kind of figured out, it's like, okay, we're just going to focus and have these like random moments. It's just like, okay, we're just going to fuck around with this character. And I feel like this is one of those scenes where like some work better than others because, again, they are talented writers. The writing here is still very good. But just logistically within the overall story itself, it kind of makes no sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you know, another storyline that's really, you know, I'm going to say that basically it doesn't really have much going on for it this episode, is with Sansa's worst nightmare.
Ironically enough, King's Landing, which is usually like which has been traditionally, obviously, throughout this season of the course of the show, subject to some of the most eventful storylines, is kind of the centerpiece of where everything is happening. Here, it's pretty minimalistic. Like, don't be wrong, there's still some good scenes, some good dialogue, some good exchanges in everything that's going on in King's Landing. But like, man, talk about a rough opening, you know.
Well, talk about a tragic day. You know, basically she goes to bed. You know, I don't know, like midnight. What time does
I don't know.
Future queen go to bed?
I don't even know how the Westerosi measure time. You know,
exactly. But she has this dream, and she's reliving the moment in which, you know, she's about to be sexually assaulted.
Yes,
except for, you know, the Hound doesn't show up. This time, they just grab a knife and they just stab her, and, you know, it kind of jolts her awake. It's
and again,
literally a traumatic nightmare from, you know, the last episode.
Yes.
And to make matters worse, she's not only, like, in this panic state, but, like, she just had her period and the bed is, you know, soaking in evidence. And, you know, she's panicking because she knows what that means. She knows that Joffrey's going to be pretty much hanging out with her nightly, and is not going to be a great experience. And that's why you tied those things together. Like the fact that these random strangers were about to attack her, and the fact that this really means that Joffrey's going to start attacking her.
Yeah. It's like, oh man,
you can understand her panic.
You want to talk about the lesser of two evils right there.
That's really strange way of putting it.
That's putting it like the best way that I can. It's like either way, she's literally screwed. Like this is just a thankless part, just a thankless position that she has found herself in. Kind of the last Stark left in King's Landing.
I think she sort of, you know, had this pie in the sky, like I'll marry a prince and it'll be happily ever after.
Right.
And
all of that has since been shattered.
She basically, you know, was complicit in Ned's death, and like she's not playing the Game of Thrones. And when you know my thesis, when you don't play the Game of Thrones, you're basically always on the chopping block to die. And she's in that position, and I think she's still naive enough to not realize like how bad she has it.
Right.
But I think this is like one of the first moments where she realizes, I was just attacked and barely saved. And now this actually means something to Joffrey and Cersei and the Lannisters, and therefore I am in trouble. I need to act now. She doesn't know what to do. She's panicking. She's literally tries to cut the bed up.
Yeah, cut the part of the mattress out with a knife. Shay
so,
comes in. Shay tries to help her flip over the mattress. A handmaiden comes in. It's like a scene out of like, I don't know,
yeah.
like what is it, like one of those like a Billy Wilder for a freaking movie, you know?
Well, it's like Paul Newman in one of his movies. Where
Yeah,
like,
there we go. I knew it was something there.
He's about threatening someone. I think Shay really does pull off this like, back alley, I got to be tough right now.
Yeah.
Paul Newman-esque like intimidation technique against this handmaiden, and
it's all for naught.
Yeah, because as soon as she walks back, the Hound
is there. Yeah, and I find it interesting that the Hound is the one to rat her out to Cersei, especially considering that the Hound gives her that whole big lecture in the hall. Again, it's one of the Hound has very interesting relationships with both of the Stark girls. I find it weird that like Martin paired that character up with kind of both of them, but it's like where Sansa thanks him for saving her, and then he turns around and throws it back, and he's like, I did it because I wanted to. That whole, like I said, more deflection. We later come to find out that it is very much deflection and that the Hound is not nearly as ruthless as he claims to be. But for right now, he's putting on this big act that like he is this truly evil man and that he's only doing it because he's this sadistic killer. And then he tries to throw it back at Sansa by saying that her father liked it too. And she's like, my father didn't like doing it. He did it because he had to, because it was his duty. And he's like, so that's what he told you. He's like, and then he does this thing where he says he lied. Killing is the greatest pleasure that a man can experience, I definitely think that, again, like I said, the Hound is deflecting this entire scene in order to cover up for his damaged character. But, like, do you think that there's, like, that in that instance as to what he's talking about, like, he could actually, like, potentially mean that, where he's, like, at least within that world, as far as, like, that whole carnal pleasure, that whole thing? Or do you think that this is just more deflection?
I think with the Hound, he's sort of like Ned, right? The world existed a certain way before Robert's reign, with the rebellion and trying to fight for something. And, there was a little more honor and stuff like that. And so I think, the Hound basically comes from that time period. And, he has a troubled past too. He got his, face put into the fire and stuff like that. So it's one of those things where he understands that the world should be a different way and that there's different rules now. And he's sort of given up on honor. I think that's the big difference between Ned Stark and the Hound. The Hound sort of accepts that it's a cruel world and that death is one of those things that unfortunately can give great joy because it means, you're standing above your enemies.
It's some relief. It's some, it's a brief, it's an exit from kind of the myriad of pain that is kind of existence within this world. Ultimately, it's ironically enough a very deep thing to come from a very, let's call it problematic statement, but I definitely think that it also kind of lends some leeway right there. Again, like I said, the King's Landing stuff in this episode is pretty minimalistic, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff that comes from the character interaction.
I think there's a really good arc here because, it starts with Sansa, and Sansa's waking up, and obviously the bed is full of blood. Well, it
starts with the scene with Sansa and the Hound, and then it's the scene where she wakes up in the bed and it's bloody.
But I think with that sort of scene of her being caught, with, basically ready to be impregnated by Joffrey.
Right.
I think that whole arc of panic, and then suddenly it goes into Cersei and Tyrion talking about controlling Joffrey and not being able to, and the fact that he's sort of a cruel king that everybody wants to kill. And, it's one of those things where Sansa's nightmare is actually a reality. Like, Joffrey is in full control and can do whatever he wants to her. And we, the audience, sort of have to fear for her safety because it's clear that he's just going to do whatever he wants. And at this point, the fact that the whole North can be solidified with this marriage between Joffrey and Sansa at this point, hey, the surest way to do so is to, unfortunately, Joffrey to get her pregnant.
Yes, unfortunately. And it's the whole thing that happens with Tyrion and Cersei is part of like, it's problematic because it's such an interesting moment here in this exchange, and it leads to probably one of the most problematic things that ends up kind of influencing the entire last two seasons, which is that this idea that like kind of the Targaryens were obviously known for their vast line of incest going all the way back to like the original bloodline, Aegon the Conqueror, right? And obviously it was known like for like hell, Daenerys herself is a subject of incest because her mother is also her aunt, her father's sister, you know? So Rhaegar, Viserys, and Daenerys were all subjects of incest. So Cersei brings up this idea of, you know, what that Joffrey is punishment for her actions with Jaime, you know, that like every time the Targaryen, you know, and she brings up obviously the quote that is later quoted by Varys, and that's also beloved series penultimate episode when he's like, every time a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin as a way to like justify Daenerys' out of nowhere mania, you know, and which in a weird way, it's still not effectively portrayed as mania, but that's for later on down the road. But I kind of hate it because it kind of sullies this really, I think, sweet and one of the first really ever one of the few earnest moments that we actually get from Cersei throughout the course of the show. And it's this very rare humane moment that happens between a brother and sister that for the most part are despise each other and are actively working against each other. You know, it's like it's this really interesting moment that reminds you, yeah, these are siblings, you know.
Yeah, I think there are just like a few times where, you know, Tyrion and Cersei can actually talk bluntly and, you know, as family and, you know, put down the cards. But obviously they're both playing the Game of Thrones and they're on opposite sides. So like this is a temporary like white truce, you know, white peace type of thing where they're willing to talk about things earnestly and get things on the table. But ultimately, you know, as we'll see in later seasons, I think season 4, when Tyrion goes for another trial by combat, a lot of the things that are said in this season are basically turned against him in his trial. So it's one of those things where even though this is a peaceful moment and things seem to be, you know, outright, you know, it's like the two of them are sort of getting along. Ultimately, that lifelong hatred is going to butt heads, and it's going to be problematic with the two of them from down the line.
Yeah, it's kind of disappointing, especially given that it's such a sweet and earnest moment between these two. But we later see these moments obviously replicated in the moments that Tyrion has with Jaime and, you know, other people as time goes on with the various interactions that he has throughout the rest of the story. But we have our last two storylines, which are probably the second two biggest storylines that happened in this episode after the Theon arc. I would say.
Well, Daenerys,
things are finally happening in Karth.
Daenerys
things are finally actually happening in this fucking city.
It's heating up, and it's one of those things that is interesting because it's like Zorro's like, oh, you know,
I didn't take your dragons, and then the next scene he's like, oh yeah, I took your dragon.
Well, okay, there is that. Basically, the surprise doesn't last that long.
Not at all.
You know,
not at all. It doesn't even last for like 5 minutes. Jorah comes back and he's like, I swore that I would protect you. And Daenerys is mad at him, kind of rightfully so, but also, I don't know. Jorah's still the only guy that's actually trying to act like, you know, he has any sense where like in her own sense of self-preservation, where he's like, we need to get you out of the city now. This is not good. And then she's like, well, find my dragons first. And she's like automatically distrusting of him. It's like, I don't know. Like, what's your take on the whole, like, her, like, being angry towards him in that one moment? Like,
I think the biggest thing that's brought up in this episode between Jorah and Dany is the fact that he's obsessed with her and potentially in love with her.
Right.
And it's clear that she
talk about that, but
yeah, she understands that. And I think she says in this episode, like, you've become too familiar. And that is sort of meant to be like, you know, hey, I'm the queen here. You're supposed to be serving me. You're not supposed to be like in love with me, like trying to, you know, be in a relationship with me. So it's one of those things where I think the boundary is sort of, you know, it's basically been blurred between the two of them. And in any other circumstances, like if she didn't have her dragons taken away from her, like, you know, she would be sort of, you know, too blind to see these advances, but because she's basically focused on the fact that the dragons have been taken away from her, she unfortunately like clearly understands and has this like strange perspective of like, you know, hey, this guy's in love with me. He's overstepping the lines. Like he's not concerned about the things I'm concerned about. So she has this like strange moment of clarity once her dragons are sort of taken from her.
Yeah, it's interesting because the whole relationship between Jorah and Dany, like many other things from the books, I think is changed drastically. Where my whole thing is, I know that they say obviously that Jorah is in love with Dany, but my whole thing is, from what I'm getting about the relationship between the two of them, at least from what I've seen, at least, and again, this is just my inference, but my whole thing is, I never saw it as he saw her as a prospective romantic thing. I always thought, at least from how it's portrayed in the show, that it feels much more so like a father-daughter relationship. Like she's the daughter that he never had, you know, at least from what I've seen, how it's portrayed in the show. Because in the books, it's written in a very specific way where he's almost got like this like creepy, obsessive like nature with her, where he's almost like more so like the mad, skittish college professor where he knows everything about Westeros and he tells her, but like he also gets kind of handsy with her. He even straight up like makes out with her at one point. Like it's very, very creepy. And when she banishes him, you almost like breathe this air of relief because it's like, yeesh, finally she's gotten rid of this guy. But like when it happens in the show, because I think the relationship between them has been so changed, like it's more matronly. It feels like more just like a stab in the heart when he's revealed to be a traitor, you know? Or when his previous treachery is revealed, at least. So that's just like that's kind of the whole thing that like what throws that scene off for me is the fact that I'm like, I never once got the sense of as to how it was being portrayed in the show that it was supposed to be like romantic in any way, shape, or form. You know, it was more so a matter of when they first met, he really had nowhere else to go. And this was a chance that he would have in order to like have a relationship with someone from his own home after he'd been in Essos for so long. And then he ends up like seeing the things that she's capable of after bringing back the dragons, and he like starts to care for her in that way. You know,
yeah,
at least that's what I've always seen.
I think Jorah's basically, you know, his motivation seems to come from that of respect, and that she maybe should be the person on the Iron Throne,
right?
And therefore that. You know, yeah, it's out of sort of more of a fatherly love or like a subject's love. Yeah, it's not one of those sort of like lustful romantic.
Like I'm telling you, if you guys don't believe me, go back and read the books and specifically read the sections where Jorah is talking to Daenerys. It gets weird in a couple of sequences, like straight up, like really freaking weird.
Well, he's probably a little more familiar in the books than he is
you can say that.
The TV show.
You can say that. But anyway, it doesn't even come close to my favorite part of the episode because, oh man, you want to talk about just like going for pure schlock, pure Temple of Doom, just like creepy, crazy imagery out of nowhere. She has her meeting with the 13. The 13, I'm sorry, like probably the most rational-minded, but also probably the simultaneously easiest characters to dupe in this entire show. Where they're like, we do not take your dragons. And then Piapri out of nowhere is just like, oh, I'm an all-powerful warlock. I'm all of a sudden now just going to be like, oh, she must be reunited with the dragons. That's why I took them to the House of the Undying. It's like, bro, like I guess he may as well be a James Bond villain, just revealing his plot right there.
Yeah, my favorite part about this scene is not even the warlock revealing the plan, but immediately Zoro
steps up.
Yeah,
oh, by the way, I
King of Karth.
become King of Karth. What are you doing?
Yeah, exactly. So immediately,
one of the most incompetent villains I've ever seen in anything.
It's one of those things. So Daenerys goes to confront the 13. Why do they have to murder them now?
Right. Like why that?
Basically,
it's for no other reason other than just to a grandiose show.
Like I think Daenerys would have started freaking out more. She would have been, you know, almost like spiritually broken if they just didn't give her any answers for longer and longer.
Right.
And then, you know, hey, you know.
By the way.
2 months later,
we got to wrap this up.
Yeah, 2 months later, it's like, oh, hey, you know, go to the House of Dragons or the House of the Dead or whatever.
House of the Undying.
Yeah, and it's like
the most problematic thing about the Warlocks because it's just like, oh, they're this all-powerful magical grouping that they get taken down by baby dragons, and they're terrible at revealing their plan.
Oh, yeah.
And then they almost try to kill her again. It's signified that there could be more out there, and then they're never mentioned again. It's like,
you know, I do like this episode in the fact that it's a cool, like, oh, hey, let's kill all the other 13, and then there's a King of Karth, and like the city has been taken over by this
it's a good story
sort of partnership.
But it feels like it's missing all these core elements. And like, if I'm remembering how this resolved the book, because I'll admit this is still fuzzy to me in the books. I never really liked this in the books either. But it was the thing about Karth is that it was a lot. It was very mysterious. There was the idea that there was something supernatural going on. You know, potentially like, you know, kind of one of those instances like an Avatar: The Last Airbender, where it's like they, you know, whenever they, you know, or like those old westerns where they would like stumble upon this village and there would like be like a ghost town almost, you know, and that's kind of the sense that you get from it. And what Zorro
like those,
does,
samurai movies, like
right,
Yojimbo.
exactly. And the things that Zorro does, like Zorro's a lot more of a cautious, a mysterious character than like the very outgoing character that he is in the show. And he takes over Karth not by straight murder, but by political leanings. And the whole thing is that even though Danny has a sense that Zorro had something to do with her dragons being kidnapped, she can never prove it, and ultimately just ends up killing Piat Pri with the dragon. So it's got a lot more of a mysterious veneer, and that's what kind of draws you in. But it's not at all mysterious here. It's obvious from minute one what's going to be happening in this city, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. And you know, it's one of those things where the Karth storyline, I think it's very minimal, and you know, it has to be broken up across several episodes. But literally the amount of content is like a one.
Is it even enough to fill? Right? Is it even enough to fill up like an episode? Like, it's
I think it is, but like it's obviously spread out through amongst the season, and it's probably the thinnest Daenerys storyline of the entire series. But you know, it kind of sets things up and gets you. It's basically she's on the back burner, but a lot of things that happen here really do lead to fantastic moments later on.
Absolutely. It's just it's oh man, the scene at the end where it's like Piat Pri, all the Piat Pri clones come out, they kill all the 13, they're going to run out, and then the clones just keep popping up. I love it when they stab them, like Jorah stabs the one, and it just like pops up with the cloth. It's like no explanation, none how they do it. We're just supposed to like take it as it's very Lynchian, it's very cool, but like in this instance, it just kind of comes off as comical.
It's like the Matrix 3 when Trinity gets stabbed. And she lives for like 15 minutes, you know.
Oh man!
It's like the warlocks get to keep speaking
pretty much
until their piece is over.
And drink their blue fluid, their liquid of the night or nightshade or whatever it is that they drink that turns their lips blue. Also, that's another thing too. The warlocks have these big blue lips in the books. They're like not even barely a shade of blue in this. Anyways, we don't need to talk about Karth anymore. It's Karth. Who cares? Let's move on to the subject of tonight's episode, which is, of course, you know, the subject, the man without honor himself, Jaime Lannister, our focus character of tonight's episode. We haven't been with Jaime in a minute in this episode, you know, in throughout this story, throughout this season, really. You know, he's kind of been a prisoner. There've been a few chance encounters, but like the thing I love about this episode is this is kind of the beginning of bringing Jaime back into the fold, and this really is the turn, because I think like Coster-Waldau, he got to show off. He was very boastful. He got to show off Jaime's arrogant side in season one, but throughout, this is where we really start to break down who Jaime is as a character, right? What he stands for, what it is that he, you know, believes in this world, and kind of how that starts off within the Westerlands, which of course his cousin Alton Lannister, again another name change for the book, comes back, gives Robb Cersei's message. Of course, she rejected the terms, and then because their dungeons are overflowing because they're taking too many prisoners. Again, another.
This is a scene to read into because, you know, Lord Bolton is just like,
Bolton,
too many prisoners,
and the introduction of Rickard Karstark too, the beginning of that whole subplot.
So there's a lot of moving pieces going on in the scene, you know, and if you watch the series before, it's like Lord Bolton already, you know, in his like first couple of appearances, is clearly not on Robb's side.
Right.
Like obviously he's there, he's giving him advice, but there's certain things that he's just like, come on, there's too many prisoners. We got to get rid of them. Robb won't do it. And, you know, if you know about Bolton and the fact that he's, you know, his banner is a flayed man.
Yeah.
It's like clearly the things that Robb stands for. Something is rotten
in Denmark in that stance.
Yeah. Basically, yeah, I agree with the Hamlet usage there. Totally.
I'm not a Shakespeare guy, but
the main thing is, Bolton is sort of the opposite of Robb, and it's quite clear. And Bolton is basically just sort of sweet talking him. And it, you know, now that I've seen the whole entire series, you know, it's quite clear that that's all he's doing is biding his time. He's making sure that Robb relies on him, and you know, he's pushing his agenda the whole entire time. But as soon as he gets an opportunity, he's just going to jump in there and try to take over because he has a different vision for how things should be.
Yes, absolutely. And even though Rickard Karstark is a little bit more of the, you know, the older line, he's again blood of the first men. Unlike Bolton, who's a little bit more ambitious, he is just somebody who actually does believe in Robb. But it started again, he is a northerner who begins to lose faith in Robb because of his attachment to Talisa, who obviously brings up this idea, I need more medical supplies. And I feel like this is the first instance where you're just like, okay, now she's really like, why is she spending this much time with him? You know, she is really starting to get into him, and it really is the beginning. This is like, again, just hammering it home that it's like, yeah, Rob is losing focus here. You know,
well, they flirt a whole bunch in the start of the the arc, and it's basically like, oh, I'll take you to the Maester's stores, and you can see the whole thing.
Yeah, it's like guys, it's like, get a room already, Jesus.
Yeah, so essentially he's going to use his ability as the king of the North to get as much medical supplies as she needs so that she can remain there helping his men and anybody that's fallen on the battlefield. And I think that's what Karstark sort of brings up. It's like, hey, you bring this foreign bee, into our camp. You give her carte blanche over all the medical supplies. This is all you care about. You're not really paying attention to what needs to be
right. And it only leads into the next brilliant decision, which is to throw the Lannister cousin in the same cage with Jaime. Gee, what could possibly go wrong there? I don't know. And Jaime ends up pulling off this, again, after another brilliant exchange. This is an episode that is filled with so many incredible exchanges, right? With Jaime and Alton kind of comparing war stories, essentially, but like as squires, and kind of like, it gives us kind of a rare insight into one of the people who probably got the least attention in medieval stories in general, which is the squire, and kind of like how they aspire to be the mighty knight and everything. And it really is, I think, fascinating as far as like to know that like that's one of the few like sort of original medieval ideas that actually like can still translate through. But of course it's nothing but a ruse, because it shows that like Jaime at the end of the day, at least in this sect of his story, is nothing more than a survivalist. He is a survivalist. He is for himself, number one.
I think it's one of the best written scenes that the show has
in the entire show.
You're talking about like the two of them are bonding, and they're kind of like long lost cousins, and it's one of those things where Jaime just has the upper hand because
he's Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer.
He's been thinking about an escape plan, but the only escape plan that makes sense is one where basically he has a fellow prisoner,
right?
He can kill and then hoodwink the guard into giving him the keys.
Right, exactly. And that's exactly what happens here. And it's really unfortunate because of the way that he phrases it, where he's like, okay, if you want to help me, you have to die, before he beats his cousin to death. I mean, he's not really like a first cousin. He's like a distant cousin. Like, that's the whole thing. There's so many Lannisters he can't keep track.
He does this creepy lean in. He's like, well,
you have to die.
There is a way, but it's like, it wasn't possible till now. You have to die. It's like it's very much. Who's the mad scientist from Batman and Robin? It's kind of like very much like that, but like a lot more low key. So he kills his cousin. He draws in the guard. He strangles the guard, who of course, unfortunately, turns out to be Rickard Karstark's son, Torrin Karstark. He's brought back the next day, found by an angry mob. This mob is out for blood. They're ready to strangle him. Catelyn and Brienne are there just in the nick of time. Brienne's great because Brienne's
awesome.
Well, they're gonna keep drinking, and they're going to keep wanting to kill Jaime.
And who's going to defend the Lannister?
Yeah, and at one point, they're going to get so drunk that they raise a sword to Jaime.
Yeah.
And who's going to want to stop them?
Right.
For killing a Lannister,
It really sucks because Catelyn's decision ultimately that erupts from this forced perspective. Obviously, she has this great square off with Rickard Karstark, where Karstark, again, rightfully so, says that Robb is losing focus and that they have kind of, been keeping Jaime for too long. Obviously, they need him because he's a tactical advantage, but like they're starting to lose their focus. They're starting to like they're getting a little thirsty for blood. That's the problem, is that when men are at war, they need to be constantly engaged, or else they're because in order to be in like that kind of, heightened aggressive state, in order to be the most effective fighters and killers, they need to constantly satiate that. And that's not happening here, unfortunately. And Catelyn begins to realize that. Obviously, she knows that they still need Jaime alive, because that's the only way that she thinks that they're ever going to get Sansa and Arya back. And the problem is that she knows that if he stays here, he's a dead man either way.
I think Catelyn goes into his prison cell knowing already that she's going to let him free.
Right.
And the
fact knows that it really sucks, because again, it's a decision that in the long run is extremely bad for them. But in this instant is the only option that she has in order to get her girls back.
Exactly. And the main thing is like Jaime sort of confronts her, and it's just like, oh, hey, it's like, I've always been loyal to Cersei, and that's the woman I've always been with.
Right. And of course, and some subtle hinting at the beginning of the beautiful Brienne-Jaime relationship that comes when he starts insulting the ever-living shit out of her, where he's calling her a beast. He's like, where did you find this? He's like, is this a woman? I'm like, wow. Just like, goddamn.
Yeah, it's Jamie is basically attacking the two of them.
Yes.
And it comes down to, well, they're also attacking him.
Right.
You're the Kingslayer, you're a man without honor, etc. Basically that's he's probably the one that the episode is named after. But the fact is, he fights back, and he basically makes the point where, I've been loyal to my sister Cersei, even though obviously there's problems with that. But Ned Stark basically brought home Jon Snow, right? So he wasn't faithful. He didn't have the honor that he basically is known to have had. And what makes him any different? He broke his vow just as much as Jamie allegedly broke his.
And keeping in mind too that this is him throwing back all of this stuff in Catelyn's face, kind of again just saying that like everyone being these righteous people and having all these vows is kind of hypocritical, because he's like, he even brings it up. He's like, there are people swear so many vows, protect your father, protect your king, yada yada yada. But then he's like, oh, but what if your father but what if the king orders you to kill your father? So that happens. And so basically it ends with her asking him for Brienne's sword, and that's kind of how that storyline ends. Again, another one that ends on a cliffhanger. This episode that ends on a couple cliffhangers, this one, and then obviously the one in Winterfell. But it's very, I think it's very interesting kind of how this erupts from the scene where she ultimately does end up letting him go, but in a sense of where it's like, it comes from just this place of great insult and great insultery, let's call it, and great anger,
Yeah, I would say that this episode it's cliffhanger after cliffhanger, and the final cliffhanger is when Theon is just like,
Theon hangs him, and he's like,
look at these kids,
look at these burned kids. You didn't think that I was serious enough, and they're like, bro, we're not taking you seriously at all,
dude. Like, to me, like, Theon is one of those characters that he's Tywin says Arya's too smart for her own good. So is Theon in this circumstance.
Right.
He's out of his element. He basically is a little more educated than the Ironborn. The Ironborn's all about paying the iron price and all this stuff. Explain to me, when they hang up the two orphan children and pretend that it's Bran and Rickon, like, why is one of the child's arms missing completely? so like Theon is like
the taller one too.
Yeah, they're just like
again, that's why, again, when a more educated person like Meister Lewin sees it, it's like, oh wait, there's fucking like there's nothing, like, these guys are full of shit. These are not Bran and Rickon.
Yeah, but so Theon decided to brutally mutilate them and then burn them, or like burn them,
mutilate them and burn them beyond recognition so that no one can see their faces.
Yeah, so it's. Well, obviously,
what I want to know is how is he able to hang them without the body's just like decomposing? Because human meat like becomes pretty docile after a certain point. It falls apart.
Yeah. So to me, it's the prop pieces were pretty good, but it also brings in this implication that it was a lot more violence,
right?
That it needed to be. Like, Theon could have just easily burned them.
It was excessive,
them up,
to say the least.
whatever.
And again, this also perpetuates and starts the rumor up that Theon murdered Bran and Rickon, which is why it goes for the longest time throughout the show. And still, at this point in the books, that Bran and Rickon are considered dead to the rest of Westeros, and kind of, in a weird way, removes them also from the main action, so that Bran can go off and has his storyline north of the wall. Fly away, fly like a bird. And
Bran's just away, doing some training so he can ultimately be picked king.
So he can get picked king. Have you heard the theory online that like Bran, as the three-eyed raven, like himself, engineered the whole Game of Thrones conflict by by placing himself there at the tower so that he could become the three-eyed raven and then take over as king?
Well, the whole time travel, like.
The whole time travel, seeing the future sort of thing.
It kind of makes sense. The main thing is like you need, basically it's all about change and whatnot, and like him having the foresight, and there's a little bit of a metaphor in there. I think it gets a little lost in just how straightforward and action oriented the final season is, and not necessarily how story driven that final season is. To say
the least. The final two seasons, I feel like we can cobble together. But so, death count for the episode, we had 4 deaths this episode. We had the Lannister cousin, Alton Lannister, R.I.P. I have a hard time just remembering your name in general. The guard, Torrhen Karstark, another prop in order to make Rickard Karstark mad at Robb, and then the 2 farm boys that unfortunately passed, that Theon passed off as Bran and Rickon. R.I.P. to all of those characters. And with that, RIP to another episode of Game of Thrones and another episode of Talkin' Thrones. We got 3 episodes left of season 2 before we get into season 3. Pat, my fellow man.
Well, one of the things that we'll never learn is, you know, what the brand storyline should have been.
Yeah,
that just never pays off.
No idea. No idea. Okay,
he
becomes God, basically. Is what it is.
Yeah, but it becomes cooler and cooler and cooler, and then it just never pays off.
And then it so doesn't.
Yeah.
But Pat, where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Obviously, I'm here on Talkin TV. You know, just chatting about Game of Thrones and. Hey, you know, look at my Instagram at Patrick W. Huber, and maybe one day I'll post there.
All right. And you can, of course, follow me at Talkin TV Podcast, Facebook and Instagram, where I post every single day about all of the stuff that we've got going on this channel. And, of course, my personal page at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. Guys, again, thank you so much for tuning in each and every week to our show. We put a lot of thought, we put a lot of effort, and we put a lot of hours into this, all to give you guys the content that you deserve. And you can help us out by clicking the subscribe button below, giving this video a thumbs up, leaving a comment below. All of that stuff helps just move us up within the algorithms that we continue to give you guys, the people, the content that you deserve. Pat, it's been another fantastic episode. Can't wait to see you guys all back next week for the next episode of Talkin' Thrones. 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. I almost forgot that there.